This story is about when Rowan made friends with the monster fairy. Rowan Elizabeth was wandering in her dreams with Fairy Willow when she saw something very unusual. It seemed to be a horse, but it wasn't a bit like Galloper. It was tall and slim. Its coat was a silvery white with a golden mane and tail. And strangest of all, it had one long blue horn on its head. Rowan had seen pictures in her storybooks, so she guessed what it was. "That's a unicorn, Willow, isn't it?" Willow nodded. "Yes, Miss Rowan, that is Lucian. He is our friend and guardian. He helps to protect us." "Protect you?" said Rowan. "What do you need protecting from?" "Well, there are creatures in your world that can be very scary." Rowan thought hard. "Oh, you mean bears and tigers and alligators and things? Well, I've seen them in zoos, and they're not really scary. They're just wild." But Willow shook her head. "No, Miss Rowan, very big animals like that don't bother us. We're far too little. But sometimes there are cats or dogs, and some birds think we'd be good to eat. They can never catch us, of course." "Why not?" Rowan asked. "Oh, because we're much too fast, and we can fly really well. Cats and dogs and snakes and birds can't ever hurt us, but we still think they're scary." "So how does Lucian help?" Rowan asked. "He chases them away. He can be very fierce when he's protecting us. He neighs and paws the ground and lowers his horn, and if that's not enough, he charges." Rowan thought that being charged by an angry unicorn would be very scary indeed. She was glad he was on their side. "Do you think he'd let me stroke him?" she asked. Willow said, "He doesn't usually let human people get close, but it looks as though you're special, Miss Rowan, because here he comes." Lucian trotted over with his head held high, so there was no danger from his sharp horn. "Hello, Miss Rowan," he said. "I'm very pleased to meet you. The fairies have told me all about you, and I would like to be your friend, if that would be acceptable." Rowan said, "Yes, please, Lucian. I'd like that very much." "Then that's settled. Would you like a ride?" Rowan wasn't too sure. The unicorn was very big, and he didn't have a saddle or bridle, but Willow said, "Oh, go on, Miss Rowan. Lucian hardly ever gives rides. He must know how special you are." So Rowan carefully climbed onto Lucian's back, and suddenly felt quite safe, even though there was nothing to hold on to. Lucian said, "I promise I won't let you fall, so let's go riding." At first he trotted slowly. Then he speeded up into a canter, then a gallop, and then he flew off into the air. Rowan said, "Whoa! You're even faster than Galloper." Lucian looked around at her. "Do you know Galloper, Miss Rowan? He's a friend of mine from back in the old country." "England, you mean?" said Rowan. "Yes, that's right. I came from there, you know, many years ago." "Oh, I'm glad you did," Rowan said. "But why did you decide to leave your home?" Lucian landed gently, and Rowan carefully climbed off his back. The unicorn thought for a few moments, and then he said, "Well, I suppose it's because I was bored with life at the castle." "You lived in a castle?" Rowan said. "A real proper castle?" "Oh, yes. There are lots of old castles in England, a lot more than round here." "What's it like living in a castle?" "Well, in the old days it could be quite exciting, with soldiers fighting and grand tournaments for the knights, and sometimes markets and fairs with musicians and jugglers. The court wizard used to do magic tricks for us, and the king and queen were very kind, and the little princesses too." "Oh, that sounds brilliant. Why did you leave?" "Well, the princesses grew up, and I suppose I did too. After a while I wanted to try something new, so I decided to come and live over here." Rowan said, "Well, Galloper comes over here lots of times, but he always flies back to England." "Ah, but Galloper is a very special horse, Miss Rowan. He's much stronger than me. I can run faster than him for a short way, but Galloper can keep going all day, and he has a magic way of flying that means it only takes a few minutes. I can't skip backwards and forwards like he does. But yes, sometimes I do wish I could go and see my friends, especially Ugron." "Who's Ugron?" Rowan asked. "He's the fairy castle monster. We used to play together when we were little, but he's probably all grown up now, and maybe he's a bit too scary to play with." "I'd love to see a fairy castle," Rowan said, "like the one on my jigsaw puzzle picture." "Well then, why not ask Galloper if he will take you over there? Why don't you call him right now?" So Rowan did, and in a couple of minutes Galloper flew down out of the sky to join them. "Hi, Lucien. Hi, Miss Rowan," he said. "Did you call?" Lucien and Rowan explained their idea, and Galloper said, "Oh, of course, no problem. Do you want to come too, Lucien?" The unicorn shook his head. "It's too far for me to fly, Galloper. I would need at least a week to recover before I could fly back. And who would protect the fairies while I'm gone?" Willow had been listening. She said, "Oh, go on, Lucien. You haven't had a holiday for years. I'm sure we can manage without you for a week or two." But Lucien shook his head. "I know that you and the older fairies will be all right, Willow, but what about the little ones? Suppose a lizard or a snake or a bird frightens them. They have to know that there's nothing to be scared of, so I must be here for them." Willow said, "I suppose you're right, Lucien. None of us fairies are brave enough to do what you do. I still think it's a shame, though, that you can't have a holiday." Rowan climbed onto Galloper's back and waved to Lucien and Willow as they flew into the sky. "Hold tight now," Galloper said, and suddenly the sky turned dark, then light again. "Well, here we are, Miss Rowan, back in England." Rowan said, "You flew all that way in just a couple of minutes. How did you do that? Takes all day in an airplane." Galloper smiled. "It's just something I can do, Miss Rowan. Now, let's find that castle." He flew around until Rowan saw, over in the distance, a building that looked very like the one in her jigsaw puzzle picture. It was made of white stone, with a big red front door. It had pink and yellow pointy roofs, with long coloured flags flying from some of them, and two big stone lions guarding the drawbridge. Rowan said, "Is that really what an old castle looked like?" Galloper said, "No, not really. Real castles were all cold grey stone and dull colours, but this is a fairy castle, so it's much nicer. Let's go in." He trotted over the drawbridge and tapped on the big red door with his front foot. The door opened, and one of the princesses stood there. She wore a lovely yellow dress with dark pink bows and a golden crown on her head. In her hand she carried a big white fan to help her keep cool. Galloper said, "Hi, Princess. I brought Miss Rowan to see you." The fairy princess curtsied and said, "I feel privileged to make your acquaintance, Lady Rowan." Galloper whispered, "Don't worry. Princess Felicia always talks like that. It's something to do with being royal, I think." Rowan said, "And I'm pleased to meet you too, Princess. Thank you for letting us into your castle." The princess said, "Please feel free to meander. Galloper is familiar with these environs, so he should be able to conduct you admirably, though it may be prudent to circumvent the subterranean chambers." She fluttered her fan and then wandered off to do whatever it is that fairy princesses do these days. Rowan looked puzzled. "What was all that about? I didn't understand a word of it." Galloper said, She said that I know my way round, so I can show you, but she thinks we shouldn't go down into the dungeons." Galloper took Rowan to see the bedrooms, with beds that had curtains all round them, but Rowan thought her princess bed was nicer. Then he took her to the ballroom, which was big enough for 100 fairies to dance in, and then out onto the battlements where she could see for miles into the countryside. And when they came down, Rowan said, "Why did the princess say we shouldn't go into the dungeons?" Galloper shook his mane. Because Ugron's down there, and or you might not like him. Rowan said, Ugron's the monster, isn't he? She wasn't sure she was brave enough to meet a real monster, but she remembered that Lucian was his friend, so she said, Can we try, please? I can always run away if I'm too scared. Gallopher said, All right, but if you do get frightened, don't run away. Just hide behind me. They went down a long line of stone steps into an underground part of the castle. It was quite dark and smelled like wet earth. At the bottom of the steps there was a big black wooden door with metal studs on it. Gallopher tapped on the door, and a gruff voice from the other side said, Go away, I'm busy. Gallopher said, Not too busy to see friends, I hope, Ugron? The gruff voice said, Gallopher, is that you? And the big door began to creak open. Rowan peeped past Gallopher's shoulder. Ugron was very big, 5 times as big as a fairy. He was covered in hair, with 2 short horns growing out of his head and big, googly eyes. When he opened his mouth, Rowan could see rows of sharp white teeth. She gave a little scream and ran to hide behind Gallopher. The door slammed shut, and the gruff voice said, Go away! Go away now! Rowan listened and heard grunting noises coming from the dungeon, but the noises didn't sound angry. They sounded sad, almost as if the monster was crying. But that was silly. Monsters don't cry, do they? She turned to Gallopher and said, Have I done something wrong? And Gallopher sighed. No, not really. It's just that everybody who meets Ugron is frightened of him. Nobody wants to play with him now, and he hasn't any friends. But that's because he's a monster. He's big and scary. Monsters are sometimes people too, Miss Rowan. He can't help the way he looks, and most people don't give him a chance to show what he's like inside. They just run away and hope he stays locked up. Rowan said, Well, that's not fair. If he's a nice monster, people should be friends with him. Well, I think so too, and so does Lucian. Rowan went quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do you think he'd come out again if I asked nicely and promised not to run away? Well, he might for you, Miss Rowan. I don't think he would for anybody else. Rowan went to the door and tapped on it timidly. Then she said, No, that won't do, and banged on the door hard enough for Ugron to hear. The snuffling noises stopped, and Rowan said, Ugron, it's Rowan. Look, I'm sorry I wasn't very polite. Will you come out and talk to us? Please? The gruff voice said, You sure you won't scream and run away? Rowan took a deep breath. Yes, I promise, she said. The door creaked wide open, and Ugron came out. Rowan saw that he was just as big and hairy as she'd thought, but he wasn't black all over. His fur was a dark orange colour, and his face was shiny and brown like leather, with 2 little streaks of tears running down from his googly eyes. Rowan reached out and touched his fur. It wasn't rough and spiky. It was soft and cuddly. She took out her handkerchief and carefully wiped away Ugron's tears. There, that's better, she said. Ugron stopped sniffling and smiled at her, and Rowan saw that even with all those sharp teeth he had a nice smile. She bravely took one of his big hairy hands in hers and said, I'm so sorry, Ugron. Gallopher and Lucian both said you were nice, but I didn't give you a chance, did I? Ugron looked down at the ground. Nobody ever does, miss. It's no fun being a monster. I have no one to play with now. The princesses are all grown up, and Lucian's gone, and I haven't any friends left in the castle. Rowan frowned. So why don't you leave like Lucian did? Ugron shook his shaggy head. Where could I go, Miss Rowan? Lucian is lucky. He's very handsome and everyone likes him, but nobody wants a big hairy monster around. That's why I stay out of sight in the dungeon and pretend to be bad-tempered.
Oh, poor monster,
Rowan said. And then she had a brilliant idea.
Galloper, she said, do you think you're strong enough to bring Ugron over to where I live?
Galloper chuckled. I'm a workhorse, remember, Miss Rowan. I could pull a heavy cart all day and not get tired. Ugron will be no problem.
Rowan turned to the fairy monster. Well, how about it, Ugron? I'm sure you'd like it better in the sunshine than down in a dark dungeon.
Ugron looked hopeful for a moment and then shook his head. Well, everyone will scream and run away from me, Miss Rowan. Fairies are like that. They're too timid to make friends with a monster.
Galloper looked thoughtful.
You're right, of course, but don't forget that Miss Rowan and Lucian and I can help. Fairies are only frightened because you look different. When they get to know you, I think they'll soon forget how you look, and if you want to be friends with them, I'm sure they'll be friends with you. Well, why not give it a try? If you don't like it, I can always bring you back here. So Rowan, Galloper and Ugron went together to see the king. He was a kindly old soul, and agreed at once that Ugron could go. Even if it doesn't work out, young monster, he said, you could at least have a holiday. You deserve that, yes. Good luck to you. The three of them flew back to Rowan's home, and of course all the fairies except Willow went and hid. Then Lucian came, and they began to peep out at the new monster in their garden. Rowan went to hold Ugron's hand, and then Willow made everything right by flying down to perch on the monster's shoulder, and soon all the fairies clustered around, stroking his soft fur, even though they were still a bit nervous. Just then a cat came into the garden and began to stalk the fairies. Lucian pawed the ground and lowered his horn, but Ugron grinned and said, Can I have a go at this one, Lucian? The unicorn chuckled. Go ahead, Ugron. This should be worth watching. Ugron drew himself up to his full height, fluffed out all his fur, beat his chest with his big hairy hands, opened his mouth to show all his teeth, and roared, Leave my fairies alone. Go away, and don't ever come back. The cat was terrified, and ran away at once to tell all the other cats that they mustn't go anywhere near the new scary monster. Rowan laughed. I'm very glad you're on our side, Ugron. And Lucian agreed. You're much scarier than I am. Do you fancy a job? I'm sure we'd be very proud to have you. Ugron said, Where could I stay? There aren't any castles round here. Oh, stay with me, Lucian said. My stable is easily big enough for both of us, and it's warm and dry, even in winter. Not like your old dungeon. Willow went over to give Ugron a hug. She was only big enough to hug one arm, but that was enough. She said, Please stay, Ugron. We'd be very safe if you're here, and my fairies would love to come and play with you. Ugron said, I'd like that very much, but I don't know how to play any fairy games. I'm much too big for hide and seek, and I can't fly at all. Oh, don't worry, Willow said. One of our favourite games is chasing. Won't it be fun to be chased by a real monster, now that we know he's our friend? Rowan had another idea. If you stay, Ugron, Lucian can have a holiday. You can look after us all while he's gone. So, in the end, it worked out very well for everyone. When everything was settled, Rowan said to Willow, You know, I didn't think I liked monsters very much, but I'm really glad we made friends with this one.